of trading for the futures and options can be substantial. Welcome to the Markets Club podcast with Cesar Delgado. We were talking about the commodities markets and counting with a new approach to the agricultural industry in Midwest alongside in Central Illinois agriculture. I am glad to join us on the Markets Club podcast on a Wednesday. The markets is closed for today because of June 9th teen in Central Illinois and across the country. Okay, we were talking about the SAF with Matt Kruse from Comstock in West Des Moines. Tomorrow is the SAF discussion panel with Illinois Corn Growers Association and Pete Meyer, Jack with Fatco Bank. Do you want to be registered for it? Please contact me at my LinkedIn. Otherwise, we're talking about Matt Kruse from Comstock. Stay tuned on the Markets Club. I'm joining with Matthew Kruse from Comstock in West Des Moines. Welcome to the show. How are you been, Matt?
I'm good. I'm glad to be here. So I'm actually in Brazil right now. So I've been here for the month of June.
Cool. Let's start with our conversation about the SAF or GREET model from this administration in Washington, D.C. What is your thoughts and feelings about the SAF?
Well, I think it's something that, people are excited about and has a lot of potential, but there's a lot that needs to be worked out yet. For those that aren't aware, it was actually the U.S. Department of Energy that put together the metrics in what they call the GREET model, which sort of defines what it means to have a low carbon score for biofuel production. And the idea being that there are a lot of consumers in the world that want their fuels to be produced more sustainably or more environmentally friendly, especially in places like Europe and California. And so they're putting a carbon score on different fuels and where and how they're produced. And so, for example, a corn ethanol plant in the Midwest might have a carbon score of somewhere in the 50 to 60 range. And the challenge is there are ethanol plants, ethanol made from sugarcane in Brazil, for example, that are made with carbon scores at 10 or even less. And so a lot of those buyers are opting to purchase their ethanol from places like Brazil. Companies like the most common option is airline companies like Delta or American Airlines, who have a large carbon footprint. They need to they want to start purchasing more sustainable aviation fuel to kind of reduce their carbon footprint. And so the problem is that the new guidelines that the U.S. Department of Energy has come out with really haven't made it so that the typical Midwest corn farm can meet those standards. And those kind of the three main things are you using cover crops? Are you using a minimum tillage or no-till? And are you reducing your fertilizer applications? Now, You can probably find a farmer that's doing at least one of those, but I think they want potentially, I think a producer to be doing all three, and that's something that's a little bit harder to do. And I think any farmer would tell you that they like to use less fertilizer, um, they like to cut costs, but they also have to weigh that against their yield dropping as well. And so that's the whole purpose of putting on the fertilizer, to get more yields, to increase your profit margin. Um, in the case of cover crops, that's probably the biggest thing that they're looking for, is the use of cover crops. And I think cover crops can be a great thing. The challenge is cover crops, in my opinion, don't really work everywhere. It depends on the season. I think they work a little bit more in the southern corn belt than the northern corn belt. I can say in our farm we have very limited growing season, to be able to apply those cover crops and to actually have it, take root and start growing. This season is atypical, but last season it's like you had maybe 2 weeks after harvest to be able to apply and kind of get the cover crops growing before the ground froze over. And that's about it. And it's just not enough time. So it's, I think, of course, it varies from region to region, but, I just don't see a lot of people north of, I-80 putting on a lot of cover crops. It's a little bit more common in the South. And so that's the problem, is they've taken a kind of a blanket approach to everything, and saying do this, even though it's really not viable for everyone. And so there's a major disconnect between what's going on with the government and what's going on out in the field, I think. And so we need to, it's important. This is something that I think we need to kind of grow our demand. So far it doesn't seem like the government is willing to meet us halfway on this. So
American ethanol by U.S. corn farmers.
yeah, one example, there's a new sustainable aviation fuel plant in Georgia called Lanza, and they've actually been buying the sustainable aviation fuel ethanol from Brazil, and which doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Because we produce a lot of ethanol, we're the largest ethanol producer in the world, and yet they're buying it from a different country because that country meets those guidelines for sustainable aviation fuel. And so we need to, the government needs to kind of come with a more concrete, model of what it takes to give us a chance to be able to meet those guidelines for sustainable aviation fuel. And so far they haven't, and it doesn't seem like they're in any rush to do it at this point. But so that's kind of the challenge there, is if we don't figure this out soon, our competitors are gonna take over that sustainable aviation fuel market.
I support for regenerative agricultural for the future in the commercial farming and just in the agricultural industry like whole. You have a lot of different opinion on regenerative agricultural and SAF. Could you tell our listeners about these things?
I think regenerative agriculture, can be a positive thing. I still think for the most part, it's kind of somewhat of a buzzword, that's been created to kind of generate interest in new products. I think the regenerative agriculture kind of incorporates some of those things that a lot of farmers do already. If it's cover crops or reduced tillage, or reduced nitrogen applications, things like that. And so I do that on my own farm. I do no-till, and I do try and reduce nitrogen applications, split nitrogen applications. I don't do the cover crops though, because I just don't think that they'll work, and they can be kind of expensive to do. And so, by that measure, does that mean that my farm is a regenerative agriculture? I don't know. I don't really consider it that way. But I think that there are way more farmers, in my opinion, that are doing some form of regenerative agriculture than most people think. And so it's maybe they aren't doing everything, but um, I think that I don't know any farmer that won't do something, that won't try something new if they think it'll make them money. And so if people want us to do cover crops, or try different things, I mean that's fine, but we have to be able to make a dollar at it too, right? So that's kind of where it's at.
Right. But we have to work together on providing practices and get more information about regenerative agriculture. However, some farmers are disagree with it.
Colder, and you have a shorter growing window, shorter summer period. And so we can't just force this on people, which I think some farmers feel like at times it's being forced on them.
Yes, right here. Farmers is a good stewardship in their farms.
Absolutely.
Matt, the ethanol industry has been called it for the electric vehicles by this administration and the EPA. But how do you see it for the future in the corn farming?
I think that the electric vehicle industry will continue to grow. Um, I don't think it's, just going to completely take over the combustible engine, at least not in the foreseeable future. Uh, I think the EV market makes more sense in the big cities, in New York and Chicago, Los Angeles, places like that. I would feel comfortable, driving long distances outside of communities, and not having a place to charge the vehicle. And I think most people kind of feel that same way. So I don't think the technology is there yet, and people aren't comfortable with it yet. That's not to say that, someday it might happen, but and so I think there's place for both in the industry. I think that's, people obviously, companies and the government are putting a lot of resources behind it to grow it. And so I think it will continue to grow. Um, Places like China are the largest producer and consumer of electric vehicles, right? But they have several, all these huge cities, and so it just makes more sense to cut down on pollution in those places. But I just don't see big demand for it out in rural communities right now, and so I think you're going to continue to see the combustion engine stick around for another generation or more yet. But it'll probably grow in tandem together into the future.
I didn't see it in the rural areas in central Illinois and the Midwest, like in South Dakota, like for example.
No, I don't think people are really interested in it. For the most part in rural communities, it's just there's not the infrastructure isn't there yet to support it for one. There's not enough charging stations, and when you're in town, there's just more infrastructure for it and more demand.
Me either. We were talking with Matt Kruse from Comstock, so we could have a conversation about Safe Green program for a long time since May.
Yeah,
Is
it's been a while.
anything would you like to go to be telling our listeners about these commodity analysis on the regenerative agricultural and cover crop?
I think people are still experimenting with cover crops, which I think is great, and I hope it'll grow. I don't know that having the government force any of these growing uh, methods, forcing those growing methods on farmers is a good way to go. I don't think people are going to respond to it well. I think it has to be voluntary adopted by the farmer, and the farmer has to see that it makes sense because it is expensive, but it takes more management to it. It's a little bit more complicated. I've had challenges where I had a cover crop um, and that cover crop, was hard to kill, hard to burn down, and kind of used up some of the nitrogen for the following crop, and so it's not as cut and dry as people might have you think. Oh, just throw on a cover crop and everything's great. And so I think uh, I wish our government understood that a little more, and maybe the non-farming community understood that a little more. But at the same time, it can work, and it is growing. The number of acres and using cover crops is growing exponentially. It's probably still a small amount of the total, but I like trying new things, and I don't think you can force it on anyone, to kind of meet your goals, because we all need to make a profit too. So
Yes, I agree, but it is pretty expensive. And you mentioned that it is hard to kill.
yeah, it can be. I suppose it might depend a little bit on your type of cover crop and the conditions, but it can be difficult to kill.
Do you have any final thoughts about these things in the ethanol production for right now?
Well, the one thing I would say is I think that one of the solutions is the pending carbon pipelines, which I think overall would be good for the U.S. corn industry. And I know that's maybe a divisive statement. A lot of people aren't maybe in favor of it. Most, I think, are. But if we get our ethanol plants connected to the carbon pipelines, overnight we become competitive with Brazil, and our carbon footprint drops to the point where um, our ethanol buyers are more interested, and we meet their threshold for what they deem as sustainably produced ethanol. And so I think that is important. Obviously we want to respect people's landowner rights, things like that. um but by and large, I think it's something that it's important for us to remain competitive. Our industry depends on these exports, and it depends on ethanol, which it makes up 40% of our sales. So, I mean, where would we be without the ethanol market? We'd have $2 corn. And so it's something that we need to defend and protect. And it doesn't mean we just roll over for the carbon pipeline companies. I think they need to, pay a pretty hefty price to be able to put a pipeline through a property. But by and all, it's going to protect the industry for another 20 years or more, and that's what we need.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
This is Matt Kruse from Comstock on the Markets Club podcast. Thanks to Matt Kruse from Comstock. You can listen to our show on YouTube and whenever you get your podcast. for the Markets Club podcast. I am Cesar Delgado.